Somewhere in a Consumer Reports data center this spring, a survey of more than 350,000 vehicles finished tabulating. And the single worst score in the entire study didn't belong to a cheap Econobox or a first-year electric startup, still finding its footing. It belonged to a mainstream three-row family SUV that most of America would have called a safe, boring choice a decade ago, the kind of vehicle nobody expected to end up as the cautionary tale. That's the story we're actually telling tonight. Not one lemon, but an entire year where the failure point quietly moved from the engine bay to the software running the dashboard. And almost nobody shopping for a new car realized the shift had happened until their screen went dark at 70 miles an hour with nothing but a warning light to explain why. Here's the pattern sitting underneath all 15 of these, and once you notice it, you can't stop noticing it anywhere else on the road either. A car used to be judged by what was under the hood. Pistons, valves, a transmission with actual physical gears turning inside it. If those held up, the car held up. Full stop. End of the conversation. Somewhere in the last decade, that changed completely, and almost nobody outside the industry noticed the shift happening in real time. The car in your driveway now runs dozens of separate computers talking to each other over internal networks, controlling everything from your speedometer to your side airbags to the way your headlights swivel around a corner. And every one of those computers runs code that somebody wrote, tested under deadline pressure, and shipped out the door regardless. A cracked piston is rare, the kind of thing that takes a genuine manufacturing defect to produce. A software bug hiding in millions of identical vehicles, built off the same shared electrical architecture, is not rare at all. And that single difference explains almost everything on this list tonight. The numbers back this up in a way that should genuinely surprise you, no matter how skeptical you walked in. The first quarter of this year alone saw a record 12.1 million vehicles recalled in the United States, the highest quarterly total ever logged in the country's history, and the overwhelming majority of that volume traced back to electronics and software rather than anything mechanical failing outright. Ford alone accounted for roughly 2/3 of that quarter's total, a genuinely staggering share for one single company to carry, but 5 manufacturers together, Ford, Toyota, Hyundai, Chrysler, and Nissan, covered better than 90% of everything recalled across the entire industry, which tells you this isn't a single company having one unusually bad year. It's an entire industry running the same experiment at the same time on the same basic underlying technology and discovering the exact same weakness in it almost simultaneously. J.D. Power's own 2026 dependability study backs this up from a completely different angle, using a completely different methodology, and still arrives at basically the same conclusion. Owners of 3-year-old vehicles reported more problems than any previous year the study has tracked in its entire history, even though the actual engines and transmissions underneath those cars kept getting quietly more reliable year over year, generation after generation. The gap, J.D. Power found, is almost entirely coming from the newest features, the giant touchscreens, the driver assistance cameras, the digital gauge clusters, rolled out to paying customers before the software running them was actually finished being tested in-house. I want to be upfront that every figure in this video is current as of this summer, not a recycled number from a year or two ago, because a couple of these stories are still actively unfolding as we speak, with new details surfacing on a weekly basis. Let's count them down, worst still to come. 15. Ford Bronco and Bronco Sport. This one is mild by the standards of what's coming, but it's the perfect small-scale preview of the whole theme running through tonight's list. Ford recalled close to 230,000 2025 and 2026 Bronco and Bronco Sport models over a software flaw in the digital instrument panel that can prevent critical information, including warning lights and your actual vehicle speed, from displaying it all while you're driving down the highway. Nothing mechanical failed. No part broke, no fluid leaked, no bearing wore out. A piece of code simply stopped telling the driver what the car was doing, and Ford's fix was a software update rather than a physical repair, which is exactly the kind of intangible problem that didn't really exist in cars a decade ago and now shows up in the recall database on a near weekly basis, quietly, without a single wrench ever needing to touch the vehicle, let alone a single part getting replaced. 14. Mazda CX-70. Mazda has spent years building a reputation as the value brand that quietly outperforms its price tag on reliability, the company enthusiasts point to when they want a fun car that won't punish them with a repair bill later. The CX-70 is the first real crack in that reputation. It's brand new, having only hit the market in the last model year, and it's already sitting in the bottom third of the midsize SUV segment for predicted reliability according to independent rankings, enough that it was passed over for awards its own strong road manners and interior should have comfortably earned it. Nothing catastrophic has surfaced yet, no single defect anyone's pointing to with a finger, which in some ways is the more worrying signal rather than the less worrying one. It suggests a brand that's historically been careful is still working out the kinks on an unfamiliar new platform, and buyers are the ones finding those kinks in real time. One small annoyance at a time, rather than one dramatic failure, which is its own quiet kind of frustrating for an owner who chose Mazda specifically to avoid exactly this. 13. Kia Telluride. The Telluride has been one of the genuine success stories of the last several years. A three-row SUV people actually recommend to friends without hedging even a little, the rare mainstream vehicle that reviewers and owners agree on almost completely. Its digital instrument cluster, though, has developed a habit of simply going blank while driving, a 12.3-inch screen that stops displaying speed and warning lights with zero notice at any speed in any conditions. Kia issued a recall covering roughly 100,000 of these vehicles back in 2023 specifically to fix this exact problem. Owners in New York and Pennsylvania are now suing because the clusters are still going blank on cars that already received that fix, which suggests the software patch didn't actually solve what it claimed to solve. Several owners reported the fault was impossible to reproduce for a technician, meaning the screen worked perfectly every time somebody was watching and failed the moment the driver was alone on the highway, the automotive equivalent of a fault that only misbehaves the second nobody official is looking, which makes the whole thing nearly impossible to diagnose through a normal service visit. 12. Kia Sportage. Kia's compact SUV lands on Consumer Reports' least reliable list this year for a cluster of complaints that individually sound minor and collectively add up to a genuinely frustrating ownership experience. The kind that wears an owner down through sheer repetition rather than any single dramatic moment they could point to and say, "There, that's the problem." Owners report ongoing transmission issues, infotainment systems that freeze or fail to respond to input, and brake pads wearing out well ahead of the schedule most owners would reasonably expect. None of these are the kind of single catastrophic failure that makes headlines or a viral video. All of them are the kind of steady low-grade unreliability that erodes an owner's trust one dealership visit at a time. And Kia's own strong warranty coverage only partially offsets how often that warranty is actually getting used in practice, month after month, visit after visit. 11. Kia Sorento. Built on shared architecture with the Sportage, the Sorento lands on the exact same least reliable list for largely the same reasons. Proof that a shared platform means shared weaknesses, whether the vehicle is a compact crossover or a larger three-row family hauler carrying an entire family's cargo and trust in equal measure. The complaints track closely with its smaller sibling, transmission concerns, glitchy infotainment, and premature wear on components that shouldn't need attention this early in ownership, sometimes barely past the factory break-in period. Kia still offers genuine value and one of the strongest warranties in the business, but a warranty is a promise to fix a problem, not a promise the problem won't happen in the first place. And this year, for a meaningful number of Sorento owners, it happened anyway, warranty or not, receipt in hand at the service counter. 10. Ford Explorer. The Explorer carries an older, narrower recall, certain 2017 through 2019 model years, covering a rear toe link that can fracture and cause a loss of steering control, a genuinely serious safety defect on a vehicle families specifically buy for its size and stability on the highway. But the Explorer earns its spot here for a broader reason too, one bigger than any single component. It's one of the nameplates caught up in Ford's staggering 2026 recall total. A company that issued 153 separate campaigns covering nearly 13 million vehicles in 2025 alone, and then proceeded to recall more vehicles in the first half of this year than most automakers manage in several years combined, let alone one. When your specific model gets swept into a shared electrical or body control module, recall alongside half a dozen other nameplates from the same corporate family. The size of the parent company's problem becomes your problem too, whether your particular Explorer was ever actually at meaningful risk or not, simply by sharing a wiring harness or a software platform with something else entirely. 9. Jeep Wagoneer. S. Stellantis' push into electric SUVs hasn't gone smoothly, and the Wagoneer S has become something of a case study in why a cautionary tale for how quickly a flagship launch can go sideways when the market and the assembly line disagree with the marketing department. Early production numbers were sharply cut back from the company's own initial targets, a quiet admission that demand or quality or both weren't where the company expected them to be at launch. The vehicle has also been swept into the broader wave of electrical system recalls hitting Stellantis products this year, joining stablemates across the Jeep and Ram lineups and campaigns addressing software and wiring faults that seem to trace back to shared components across the whole corporate family. For a vehicle positioned as the flagship of Jeep's electric future, landing in the same recall conversation as decades-old mechanical problems on much cheaper vehicles isn't the launch story any automaker wants attached to a brand new, expensive nameplate, especially one meant to prove the brand could compete in a genuinely new category. 8. Chevrolet Equinox and GMC Terrain. Same compact crossover platform, same assembly plant, so these two share a slot, and General Motors leads the least reliable SUV rankings this year, largely because of this exact pairing sitting at the very top of the wrong list, a list no automaker actually wants to top. Owners report failures in the transmission control computer itself, along with severe fluid leaks serious enough that some repairs require pulling the entire transmission out of the vehicle rather than a simple seal replacement done in an afternoon. On top of that, the body control module, the component quietly managing everything from your power windows to your central locking system, has developed a pattern of recurring failures that leaves owners cycling through dealership visits for problems that keep coming back after supposedly being fixed for good. These are two of the best-selling compact crossovers in the country, which means this isn't a niche complaint affecting a handful of unlucky buyers tucked away in a forum somewhere. It's a mainstream problem hiding inside two of the most common vehicles on American roads. Not a rare edge case buried in a forum thread somewhere, which is exactly why it belongs on a list like this one, instead of getting quietly ignored. 7. Hyundai Tucson and Santa Cruz. Hyundai recalled roughly 421,000 Tucsons and Santa Cruzes this year after discovering a software malfunction in the front camera system. The same camera feeding blind spot warnings, automatic braking, and lane keeping assistance behind the scenes. When that system misbehaves, you're not just losing a convenience feature you can shrug off, you're losing a safety system the vehicle is actively relying on to intervene in an actual emergency, without you ever noticing it's gone quiet. Both of these nameplates are genuine volume sellers for Hyundai in North America, real workhorses of the brand's entire lineup strategy, which means this recall isn't touching a small, unlucky batch tucked into one production run. It's touching a meaningful share of the actual vehicles Hyundai sold this generation, on hardware most owners assumed was a mature, thoroughly tested safety feature, rather than a system still working through software bugs years into production, quietly in the background, while everyone assumed it was simply doing its job. 6. Rivian Consumer Reports ranked Rivian dead last of every single brand it evaluated for overall reliability this year, out of every automaker selling a vehicle in America, and the company's SUV, the R1S, carries its full share of that brand-wide reputation. Owners report software glitches severe enough to require full system reboots in the middle of a drive, along with drivetrain and electrical faults that echo the same growing pains, showing up across Rivian's entire lineup, truck and SUV alike. None of this erases what Rivian actually accomplished, building a genuinely competitive electric vehicle from scratch and beating far larger, far better funded companies to market with something people are proud to park in their driveway. But pride and dependability are different conversations entirely, and a young company scaling production faster than its quality processes can keep up with is exactly the story playing out underneath that dead last ranking, a growing pain that money and time can fix but hasn't fully fixed yet. 5. Chrysler Pacifica. Hybrid. Chrysler's plug-in hybrid minivan carries real problems in both of its major systems at once, which is an unusual and specifically bad combination for any vehicle to have simultaneously. Owners report major transmission and engine component failures alongside issues in the hybrid system itself, including EV battery cooling malfunctions and in-car electronics that freeze or go completely blank at random moments. One owner described a genuinely alarming moment during what should have been a routine service visit, being told the engine had lost oil pressure entirely at around 3,500 miles into ownership with no apparent external leak to explain why, a red flag for a manufacturing defect on a vehicle that young and that lightly used. Add in a history of separate recalls covering battery fire risk, serious enough that owners were told to stop charging and avoid parking near buildings altogether, and you have a minivan that's supposed to be the safe, sensible choice for a family, failing in exactly the two places that matter most to that exact buyer, the powertrain and the battery pack sitting underneath it. 4. Jeep Grand Cherokee Stellantis recalled just over 419,000 Grand Cherokees this year over a software error inside the occupant restraint controller, the computer responsible for deciding when your side airbags deploy in a crash and how quickly they fire. The bug caused the system to permanently retain old pressure sensor fault codes even after the vehicle had been repaired and the codes should have cleared, which could delay side airbag deployment during an actual side impact collision at the worst possible moment. What makes this one especially unsettling is the timeline behind it. Stellantis first saw warranty claims related to this issue back in early 2023, spent more than 3 years chasing down wiring harnesses and sensors as possible culprits, ruling out one component after another, and only traced the actual root cause to the restraint controller's software this past spring. For 3 full years, Grand Cherokees were on the road with a safety system that might not fire correctly in the exact moment it mattered most, and the only warning most owners had was a dashboard light easy to mistake for a routine sensor glitch rather than a genuine crash safety concern, the kind of light most drivers learn to ignore after the first false alarm. 3. Nissan Rogue. Nissan recalled more than 640,000 Rogues this year over a genuinely severe defect in the bearings of its turbocharged 1.5-liter 3-cylinder engine, a defect that goes well beyond the usual inconvenience recall. In the worst case, that bearing failure can breach the engine block itself, releasing hot oil and creating a real fire risk, on top of the more immediate danger of a sudden total loss of drive power while merging or changing lanes in traffic at speed. This is one of the best-selling crossovers in America, a vehicle marketed specifically as a sensible, dependable family choice for people who explicitly do not want excitement from their commute. Carrying an engine defect capable of both stranding you mid-maneuver and, in a worst-case scenario, catching fire underneath the hood. That combination, mainstream popularity paired with a genuinely dangerous failure mode rather than a mere annoyance, is exactly what separates a merely irritating recall from one that belongs this high on a list like this one. And it's exactly why federal regulators moved on this one faster than they have on some of the entries lower on tonight's countdown. 2. The dashboard epidemic. Nobody named until now. Before we reach the single worst vehicle of the year, it's worth naming the pattern connecting an enormous slice of everything you've just heard, because it's bigger than any one nameplate on this entire list. Over roughly the last 18 months, at least 7 separate manufacturers, Toyota, Lexus, Ford, Ram, Mercedes-Benz, Hyundai, and Kia, along with Nissan showing up in related complaints, have issued recalls covering more than 1.5 million vehicles for the exact same underlying failure, digital instrument clusters that simply go blank while the vehicle is in motion. The analog gauge cluster your grandparents' cars used never had this problem, because there was no software layer sitting between the sensor and the needle for a bug to hide inside in the first place. Defenders of the digital dashboard will point out correctly that these screens now display far more useful safety information than a speedometer and a fuel gauge ever could manage. Blind spot camera feeds, lane keeping visuals, adaptive cruise status, all in one place. All true. None of it changes the fact that 7 competing automakers, companies that spend billions trying to beat each other, independently discovered the exact same weak point in roughly the same window of time, which tells you this was never really a one-company mistake. It was the entire industry's collective homework assignment, and a meaningful share of America is still waiting on the actual answer key to arrive in the mail, one notification letter at a time, spread out across 7 different corporate mailrooms. 1. GMC Acadia. And here's where this list lands. On the single vehicle, Consumer Reports says performed worse than every other car in its entire 2026 survey of more than 350,000 vehicles nationwide, the largest single data set the magazine has ever compiled for this ranking. The Acadia carries major reported problems in both its transmission and its engine. The 2 components a reliability survey weighs most heavily of all, plus recurring electrical accessory failures, and an infotainment system prone to freezing or going completely blank behind the wheel at inconvenient moments. GMC has issued more than 20 separate recalls covering this nameplate since its redesign, an extraordinary number for a single vehicle generation, and dealerships have logged nearly 2,000 additional technical service bulletins on top of that, GMC's own internal instructions for fixing complaints that never rose to the level of a formal recall but kept happening often enough to need a standing repair procedure anyway. J.D. Power had already flagged the outgoing model as only average, citing excessive engine noise and climate control complaints from real owners. And Consumer Reports' own conclusion for the redesigned version was blunt, stating outright that it wasn't making any meaningful leap forward and would likely finish as the least reliable vehicle on the entire list before testing was even complete. It did exactly that, without a single surprise along the way. A 3-row family SUV, bought specifically by people prioritizing safety and predictability over excitement or performance, ended up the single worst performer in the largest reliability survey conducted in the country this year, a genuinely strange fate for the exact kind of buyer who thought they were making the boring, safe choice. The honest takeaway. Now, I have to be fair because that's the deal on this channel, and a list this alarming deserves some real context before you swear off new cars entirely and start eyeing a horse. Consumer Reports builds its rankings from its own subscriber base rather than manufacturer-provided data, which means its sample skews toward a specific kind of engaged, detail-oriented owner who notices and reports problems more readily than the buying public as a whole would. Someone reading a car magazine closely enough to fill out an annual survey in the first place. That's actually a real strength in one specific way, since automakers like Tesla that decline to participate in other studies can't opt out of Consumer Reports' survey the way they can elsewhere, giving you visibility you simply wouldn't get from an industry-funded source. But it does mean the raw numbers aren't a perfect mirror of every single driver's actual experience out on the road. It's also worth saying plainly that a recall is frequently the system working exactly as intended rather than evidence of a car actively falling apart on the road beneath its owner. A number of the entries on this list, the Bronco's display bug, the Explorer's shared platform recall, the Wagoneer S's early production hiccups, are software fixes and safety notices catching a problem before it becomes a genuine hazard, not proof the vehicle is unsafe to drive today or tomorrow. J.D. Power's own 2026 data actually shows traditional gasoline powertrains getting quietly more dependable year over year, even as the surrounding feature set outpaces the industry's ability to fully test it before shipping to a dealer lot. The mechanical heart of most of these vehicles isn't the problem, and hasn't been for years now. It's everything bolted onto the outside of that heart, competing to be the flashiest screen in the segment, arriving on dealer lots before its own software finished growing up in the lab where it belonged a little longer. And it's worth remembering that owner satisfaction and measured dependability, the two things this whole list has been quietly comparing, are not the same survey asking the same question, no matter how often they get conflated in a single-star rating. Rivian owners overwhelmingly say they'd buy another Rivian tomorrow, dead last reliability ranking and all, because the driving experience itself still delivers on what drew them to the brand in the first place. A Kia Telluride owner suing over a blank instrument cluster still probably loves everything else about the vehicle, enough to have kept it this long rather than trading it in at the first sign of trouble. The seats, the space, the way it drives on a long highway trip. Those two feelings, frustration with a specific system and genuine affection for the vehicle as a whole, coexist far more often than a countdown video like this one has room to fully capture. If there's one honest takeaway sitting underneath all 15 of these, it's that the specific defect matters enormously more than the badge on the hood ever will. A transmission fluid leak and a blank instrument cluster and an airbag that might not fire on time are not the same category of problem at all, even when they all get filed under the same word, recall, and treated as equally alarming by a scrolling comment section that rarely distinguishes between them. Look up the specific complaint, the specific model year, and whether the actual root cause has been found yet, because as this year proved more than once, a recall that claims to have fixed something isn't always telling you the whole truth about what's actually happening under the skin of your own car, whatever the letter in your mailbox says. Picture the two ends of this list, side by side for a second, because they genuinely do rhyme with each other in a way that's easy to miss on a first watch, even after 15 entries and everything in between. A buyer somewhere signs the paperwork on a family SUV, trusting that a familiar, boring badge means a familiar, boring ownership experience. A software team somewhere else, working against a launch deadline nobody in engineering actually chose, ships a digital dashboard they know still has open bugs, trusting that the fixes will land before too many customers notice. Neither one of them got what they were counting on this year, and depending on which of these 15 happens to be sitting in your own driveway tonight, you might already know exactly which version of that story you're currently living inside, warning light and all.